Any day where wheels show up to the shop more or less feels like Christmas, and that's pretty fitting because this is about as close to Christmas as we could possibly get. I finally settled on wheels for the E36, and if you know me, you know I like the old stuff, the rare stuff. This fits into both of those categories. I landed on a set of vintage HRE 525 three-piece wheels. They're going to be perfect on the E36, not only from a fitment standpoint, but from an era standpoint. They're period correct. They're gonna look amazing. These are some of the coolest wheels I've bought in a while, and it's probably pretty obvious that I'm excited. But before we put them on the car, we've got to finish our front suspension build. We've got new coilovers to install, we've got front control arm bushings, and we've got to talk a little bit about brakes. So let's get that work wrapped up so we can install these wheels and put this thing on the ground once again. Picking up from our last episode, we have the rear suspension all buttoned up on the E36, and we got the car back on the ground and rolling once again for the first time in 6 months. But we still have a lot of front suspension pieces to install, such as the coilovers and the front control arms. This time around, we've opted for factory control arms from a 1995 M3 and spherical bearings for the front control arm bushings. In order to install these parts, we've got to tear the front end of the car apart once again. We'll start this process by pulling off the old coilovers, which thankfully on an E36 is a very simple process. It's just 3 bolts on the strut hat and 3 bolts at the bottom. And as simple as that, both sides will come out in a matter of minutes. For precaution's sake, I'm going to support each side with a bungee cord so that things aren't hanging by the brake lines. Up next is removal of the control arms themselves, which are held in by 2 ball joints and 1 bushing. The bushing unbolts with 2 bolts, and the ball joint attached to the subframe typically drops right on out. It's only the ball joint on the knuckle itself that requires a puller. With all 3 removed, the control arm will drop free, or if you've got a base model 3 series, it'll hang from the sway bar. Now we're headed over to Brett's once again to use his compound Arbor press, this time to separate the bushing from the control arm bushing housing. This press is not only significantly more powerful than my hydraulic press, it's also so much easier to use, and it's going to make quick work of these bushings, as you'll see here in a moment. We just need to press this piece out of the housing. The Arbor press is a mechanical press that offers a significant mechanical advantage for simply operating a lever. This footage is in real time, and you can see just how easily it pushes the bearing out of the housing. Next, we need to install our spherical upgrade, and while this isn't really a press fit part, the press is definitely going to make this easier to put together. After applying some Loctite and torquing down the bolts, the completed assembly looks something like this, and now we need to actually install it onto the control arm. I think that setting this part up in a press would be a huge pain, so I decided to use an air hammer for the installation of this part and found it to be incredibly simple. This wasn't suggested in the instruction for this part, but it would definitely be my go-to anytime I do this in the future. Just like the sleeve, we've got to install the bearing itself, so I reused the air hammer and the installation tool and pressed it right on into place. And again, this seems so much better than using a press or a hammer. So I'm hopeful that any E36 guys out there will heed this advice. Now we're actually ready to install the parts onto the car, so I simply went reverse of the removal instructions. I started with the outer ball joint and got it tightened down, and after hoisting everything into place, I was able to install the central ball joint. There's not nearly as much room on the driver's side of the car as there is the passenger, so it's a slow process to get it torqued down, but a swivel head ratchet made this a much simpler job than it could have been. Last are the spherical bearings that we just installed moments ago, and those are held in by a pair of 18mm bolts, which we've Loctited into place to make sure they won't come apart. And a quick note, because I got a couple of comments about it and there was some confusion. On E36s, there are offset control arm bushings. You'll notice that these are not centered. In order to run the offset ones, you have to have 1995 M3 arms or it'll throw your caster off. So I've got 95 M3 arms going into the car, and therefore I have 95 M3 offset control arm bushings pressed into my control arm bushing housing. So hope that answers something for you guys. I believe that to be correct. I'm not an E36 guru, but that's what it's supposed to be, I think. All right, so I got the control arms installed. Realistically, I should do tie rods while I'm in here, but I don't have them and I don't want to hold up just for that, so I'm going to add that to the to-do list. And then also on the to-do list, we got brakes. Now, in the last episode, we put M3 brakes on the rear. I mentioned I was waiting on parking brake parts, and then I had M3 calipers for the front. Now, some of you guys, rightfully so, held my feet to the fire and said, dude, you put all that work into that rear end, and you put dirty, gross old brakes on it. What are you thinking? And honestly, I wasn't. I got lazy, and I should have done something better. However, I have since found out that because I have non-M trailing arms and we just rebuilt the entire back end, I'm not going to change them to M3 arms, but I can't put M3 parking brake parts on a non-M trailing arm, so I'll have no parking brake with that rear setup. And then for the front, I would have to change to M3 knuckles. It's not interchangeable. And all of this is just spiraling to put M3 brakes on the car when that's not a great upgrade. So I'm going to scrap this brake plan, the M3 brake plan, and I weighed out some options. I thought about buying like a legitimate big brake kit, but there's not a ton of options that are kind of cost effective for the front and the rear. And I've read a lot about people using 996 brake calipers and adapters on all four corners in order to have a kind of budget-friendly brake setup. So I'm gonna give that a shot and give you guys a review on it. We'll do the full brake build in an episode and talk about kind of what has to get done. My buddy Asad Hussein on Instagram's helping me source all of the parts. He's having the calipers rebuilt, powder coated. So we'll have brand new, so to speak, brakes on all four corners of the car. Big brake kit that'll fit under 17s, which is important. And I'm excited to dive into that and show you guys all those parts once we get there. That'll be after the holidays. But again, on the to-do list, I'm excited to do that. Thank you guys for calling me out on crappy calipers. With everything else out of the way, it's finally time to install the coilovers, the most important part of the front suspension, and with those, the old camber plates from my former coilover setup. With everything else being nice and new, I decided to give them a quick cleanup with some brake clean just to get the road grime off from several years of driving. And with that, I was able to install them with some custom adapters to adapt them to the shock shaft diameter of the H&Rs. These things should be ready to go on the E36, although my only concern remaining is that our wheels might be too high in offset to clear the tender spring on the coilovers. That's nothing some H&R spacers won't fix though, and that's a problem we can solve once we get there. And on the topic of helper springs and tender springs and spring preload, I want to touch upon it really quick because it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. Tender springs and helper springs are different. Tender springs are part of a dual spring setup. It's very complicated. You don't see them very often outside of full-blown race cars. When you see a coilover with two springs on it like this one here, this is a helper spring, and its sole purpose is just to keep the spring seated when you extend the shock body or unload the car. Now, a lot of people out there talk about spring preload and things like that. If you have a linear spring, which these are, and most coilovers are, unless you have a progressive spring. Some coilover kits come with them. They usually have kind of an odd shape to them. They look like a beehive or things like that. For linear springs, there's no such thing as spring preload. It's not a real thing. It's a myth. You will not do anything to your suspension by cranking down your coilover spring perches and trying to change the preload. It doesn't work that way. So whoever's telling you to adjust your spring preload like that, it's not true. Just ignore them. It's fake. It's a myth. Back to actually installing the coilovers on the car. Thankfully, this is just about as simple as removing them. However, anybody that's ever installed coilovers by themselves knows the most frustrating part is trying to hold the coilover up in place while attaching the top hat nuts by yourself. Lining up the bolt holes on the knuckle side can be a bit of work, but with the hardware installed, our coilover install is complete. And it's finally time to get to the most important part of the video, the reason you're watching. And no, it's not a set of niche road wheels, it's much better than that. Inside these boxes, we've got an all-original set of HRE 525s, measuring out to 17 by 9.5 with a plus 38 positive offset. These things have been completely restored with black barrels, all new sealant, polished lips, and silver centers, and I'm not sure they've even been run on anything, to be honest. I toiled for a long time trying to decide what the perfect wheel for the E36 would be, and I genuinely think that I have landed on it. Not only are these period correct, it's really hard to beat a classic 5-spoke design on the E36 chassis. For tires, we've got a fresh set of Nitto NT01 R comps to go on, measuring out to 235/40 R17. Frankly, these sound a bit slim for a 9.5-inch wide wheel, but NT01s run wide, and once mounted up on the wheels, they look absolutely perfect. I think this setup sits somewhere between a nice meaty look and a little bit of stretch to get that perfect amount of fitment. Because my fenders are worked quite a bit, these should fit nicely. Alright, first one's bolted on and I'm already freaking out. This is going to be way too sick. I worked my way around the car, installing the rest of the wheels, getting more and more excited with each one. As anticipated, the fronts needed a 10mm spacer in order to clear the helper spring, but otherwise we're ready to see this thing on the ground. So obviously we do need a ride height adjustment here, as well as some spacers at the back of the car to get this thing set up properly, but I'm really happy with how it's turning out, and this is the exact look I was hoping for when I bought these wheels. We've got new kidneys installed, and they complement the new headlights really well, and it's just a waiting game before the fog lights and the bumper mesh and the front lip show up. I think we're on the home stretch for the exterior of the E36, which really just leaves a few tidbits besides the interior, which will be a big project in and of itself. There's still a long way to go on this thing, but this feels so freaking good. I am so stoked to have this back on the ground and on wheels. I haven't gotten to see it on wheels in its entirety of being in this shop, and I've been in this building for, over 8 years now, so if that tells you anything, it's been a hot minute. Now, in terms of what's next, obviously I need to do some tuning on the ride height, and I need to get H&R to send over some small spacers so I can dial in the wheel fitment and get it just right. Somewhere here in the shop, I've got M door trim, so I'm gonna track that down. I need to order up all new bumper trim, and then we've got all of the glass to put back in the doors and all the new rubber trimming for in the doors and the window gaskets and things like that. I don't know how quickly we'll get to it, but that's what's next on the list, and once we do that, we'll be pretty close to driving it. I'm gonna put the drive shaft back in it. That's the last thing underneath, I think. We gotta put some fuel back in it, and we need to do an alignment. An alignment's pretty important as well. But we're getting really close. I'm excited. I'm not gonna rush it, but man, this feels pretty good. And hopefully our interior will show up pretty soon. We need to go buzz Evan about it. I'm excited. I hope you guys are enjoying the build content as always. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe. It helps me out. And you don't want to miss what comes next. We're about to drive this thing, maybe in the next episode. I don't know. We'll see. I'll catch you guys next week. Thanks as always.